Good morning. I'm Brent Glass. I'm a historian and formerly the director of the National Museum of American History. I'm going to talk about the public memory of George Washington. Tomorrow is George Washington's birthday. We don't celebrate his birthday anymore, but you don't really need to celebrate his birthday to know that George Washington is honored throughout our country in probably more than any other person. 121 cities and towns, 7 mountains, 10 lakes, 32 counties, 9 colleges, a state, our national capital. Washington is perhaps our first superhero. He's everywhere. And his image and his name is ever present throughout our country. So how did we get to that point? How did he become such a singular figure in our public consciousness and in our public memory? And by public memory, I mean the stories we tell that reinforce our values and beliefs about certain people, events, and places. Public memory is subjective and selective. Sometimes it can even be propaganda. Public memory is different than history. History is evidence-based, fact-based, and is based on written evidence and physical artifacts and oral history. Public memory is something a little different. And as a historian and as the director of the American History Museum and involved in museums across the country, it's important to me to know, to understand and explore the difference between public memory and history. So we're going to talk about that for the next few minutes. And it's especially important this year because it's the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So you're going to hear a lot about American history and about American public memory. How do we remember those events? I would encourage you to start with the Declaration of Independence, and especially the first paragraph of the Declaration that states we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then the next sentence says that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. So in one short sentence, the Declaration of Independence states the core values of American identity, what makes us truly exceptional: equality, human rights, and self-government. George Washington was the pivotal figure of that time. He was what some people call the indispensable man. Without George Washington, we may not have had a country. Now, Benjamin Franklin's cane is one of the prized artifacts at the National Museum of American History. Franklin, in his will, gave his cane to George Washington, and he said if it were a scepter, it would become him. That's how highly respected and highly regarded George Washington was, even in his lifetime. Why was that? Why did Franklin feel that way? When the British surrendered at Yorktown, shortly after that surrender, George Washington actually gave up his command as the military leader of the American Army. When King George III heard that Washington had done this, that he had surrendered power, he said, if Washington actually did this, he's the greatest man in the world. Now, why did he say that? Because at that time, no one voluntarily gave up power. But yet Washington did that. At the time of his death in 1799, one of the eulogists said, Washington is first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen. So even in his lifetime, he was a celebrity, he was respected, and people were in awe of George Washington. Now, within a year after Washington died, biographies and books started to appear. There have been 3,000 books written about George Washington. One of the first was by Parson Mason Weems, and it was called The Life of George Washington with some amusing anecdotes. Well, when we look at that book, Parson Weems created a folklore about George Washington. Did he really chop down a cherry tree and then tell his father that I cannot tell a lie? We don't know that that happened, but Parson Weems tells that story as a way of reflecting George Washington's reputation for honesty. Did George Washington throw a silver dollar across the Potomac? Probably not, but it does reflect his athletic ability. So Parson Weems' book was full of stories like that are sort of the truth, but more influencing our public perception rather than the actual history. One of the avid readers of Parson Weems' book was Abraham Lincoln. He was born in 1809, so the Weems biography was in circulation, and Lincoln was an avid reader, and this was one of his favorite books. The historian Doris Kearns Goodwin tells a story that Lincoln liked to tell. It wasn't in Weems' book, but it was in another anecdote, and it has to do with an American who was visiting London shortly after the American Revolution. And the British host had put a picture of George Washington in the outhouse. British host asked the American, "Are you insulted that George Washington's picture is in the outhouse?" And the American said, no. The best way to get an Englishman to shit is to see a picture of General George Washington. There are other examples I'm going to share with you from the 19th century that began to shape this heroic, legendary, larger-than-life image of George Washington. The statue of Washington by Horatio Greenough, which now is in the National Museum of American History, depicts Washington as a Greek god. Now, Greece was the model for many Americans as the first democracy, so many artists and architects referred to or were inspired by the stories about Greece. But this statue of Washington is interesting for several reasons, showing Washington as a mythic Greek god. In his left hand, he's holding out a sword, and this is symbolic of him giving up his military rank, his military power. That was a story that was really important to people in the 19th century, that Washington surrendered power even when he could have become a military dictator. But a bare-chested Washington offended some of the 19th century critics, and so the statue was moved and finally was moved to the National Museum of American History. Another famous, iconic image of Washington is Emmanuel Leutze's painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. And this painting now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it reflects Washington's courage, his patriotism, his leadership, and it was one of the most popular paintings about American history even in its own time. And today, as I say, it's at the entrance of the American wing of the Metropolitan. Construction on the Washington Monument began about the same time that Leutze's painting was completed and Greenough's statue was completed. And the Washington Monument, which took almost 40 years to complete, stands at the center of the national capital. It's also inspired by classical architecture, in this case, in the form of an Egyptian obelisk. But it reflects the awe and reverence that people had for George Washington. Finally, in the 19th century, the final example I'll include here on the discussion of public memory is out Mount Vernon. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which was the first preservation organization in America, purchased Washington's plantation home in 1860, along with 200 acres. And the purpose was to show Washington as a gentleman farmer, as a successful American patriot. But over time, and especially in the last several decades, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association have expanded the interpretation of George Washington to include the enslaved population, the people who actually worked and lived and made Washington so successful. And it's this issue of Washington as an enslaver that has caused many people, many historians, to reconsider his reputation and to call attention to some of the flaws in Washington's biography. The musical Hamilton, which was first performed in 2015, is a good example of how Washington is presented as a more complex figure. He's vulnerable, he's doubtful, he's dependent on his associates. The fact that Lin-Manuel Miranda used the biracial cast and included hip-hop and rap music and lyrics was another way to try to make Washington and his contemporaries less than godlike figures, but more human and more accessible. Last year, the documentary on the American Revolution by Ken Burns also presented Washington as a more complex individual. Ken Burns concludes that Washington was the indispensable man, that without Washington there would be no United States. But he also points out that Washington lost more battles than he won. Washington was involved in the displacement of indigenous peoples from their lands in the Ohio Valley. And Washington, as we said earlier, was an enslaver. Nearly 600 people were enslaved at Mount Vernon during Washington's lifetime. So this complex legacy, this complex memory of Washington is something that we contend with today. And I'll close with a reference to the president's house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, Washington never lived in the White House. The White House was under construction in Washington, in what was later became Washington, D.C. But he lived in a house in Philadelphia during his 2 terms in office. And the National Park Service placed a new exhibit at the Liberty Bell, right next to the Liberty Bell, which talks about and tells the story of the 9 enslaved individuals who worked and lived at the president's house while Washington was president. And if you can see one of the names there, Oni Judge, was a woman who escaped from Philadelphia. And one of your professors here at Emory, Erica Dunbar, has written an award-winning book about Oni Judge and her escape to freedom in New Hampshire. In January, the National Park Service removed the exhibit that talked about slavery at the president's house. They removed this exhibit in response to an executive order that called for the national parks to remove any content that would disparage individuals at our national parks and national sites. And then just this week, a federal judge in Philadelphia ordered the National Park Service to put the exhibit back in place. And she started her opinion with a reference to Orwell's 1984, the novel that describes a dystopian society. And she said that Orwell said in that society, history was scrubbed clean and reimagined or reinscribed. And that is the question I want to close on with, and I wasn't sure how I wanted to end this talk, because I do believe that George Washington is one of our greatest leaders. He gave up power not once, but twice. He surrendered his military leadership, and then as president, he chose not to run. He could have become president for life, but he chose not to run for a 3rd term. And in fact, in the musical Hamilton, that's one of the turning points in the musical, is when Hamilton and Washington write his farewell address. So it's very unusual in public life to have an individual who could have become a military dictator. He could have been made a king. He could have been president for life. But he understood that a democracy could not survive with a single ruler, and that the consent of the governed was the most important element of a democracy. So with all of that, Washington did have his flaws. And the fact that he was an enslaver is something that we have to contend with as historians. But I don't think we should turn the clock back and erase history and try to create a superhero out of George Washington, when I think we can hold the truth and still admire what he accomplished. So I'll leave you with that question. Are we able to reckon with information, additional information about the iconic figures in our history, and still respect them in spite of their flaws? Thank you.